Okay, we're going to give it another just about 30 seconds. Make sure that everybody is online. In the meantime, please take a look at the general disclaimer for this presentation. Any pictures or trade names of equipment, companies, or services should not be construed to indicate an endorsement by N.J.A.C of any product or service derived from same. The information within this presentation is slated to facilitate discussions on various existing and potential regulatory mechanisms. No final decision regarding this information is expressed or implied by DEP. Next slide. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome back to the N.J.A.C Stakeholders Meeting Series for the Select Recycling Exemption discussions at N.J.A.C 726A-1.4. My name is Judith N.J.A.C. I'm your moderator for today. I'm the Regulatory Officer for the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program. We're going to ask that you keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation today until we call on you to talk. We also ask that you only use the chat function for your explanation of experiencing technical issues. If you are having problems with your audio, if you're having problems with your video, if there are parts that you might be missing or not be able to understand with your speakers, those type of questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, when it comes to comments on the presentation, we would ask that you use the raise your hand function so that we'll be able to call on you accordingly. In those moments, you'll have the opportunity to voice your opinions and concerns. We ask that you, at that point in time, once you're called on, that you unmute yourself so you can speak. It's up to you whether you would want to be on camera or not. That is specifically your discretion. Next slide. Now, the big question for today is, why are the amendments to the rules necessary? Basically, the department is looking to minimize potential adverse environmental impacts from noncompliance. We're proposing limits on storage amounts and durations for the exemptions. For better enforceability, we're looking to do some amendments because we're looking to increase and improve reporting requirements for those that hold exemptions. We're also doing it to make sure that we have better coordination with local and county officials. We're proposing notification and record-keeping requirements. Basically, within the existing exemptions rules, it's been unclear if appropriate local and county officials have received notifications that entities have taken these exemptions under state rule. There are 565 municipalities in the state, and they all handle paperwork differently. We've had some instances recently where it was made clear after the fact that operators of exemptions didn't notify the correct local officials and didn't receive all of their necessary local and county approvals. We're also considering deleting exemptions that exist that are not necessary or that might be problematic for the regulated community. We're looking to combine like activities, and we also recognize the need for additional new exemptions. Next slide. You're going to notice that today's presentation has a recurring theme. We're addressing exemptions to solid waste and recycling regulations only. We'd like you to keep in mind that the activities we're discussing may require other permits from other NJDEP programs. Other program area regulations, such as air and stormwater, may apply. This slide includes regional points of contact for the air program. Next slide. In a continuation of that theme, the activities we're discussing may require other permits from other DEP programs, and that also includes stormwater. This slide includes DEP stormwater points of contact, depending on if the operator is a municipality or another entity. Next slide, please. Thanks. Just a little bit of an introduction of who we're going to be talking with today. Again, I'm Judith N.J.A.C from the Assistant Commissioner's Office for the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program. We also have here from our Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, Karen Clue, Bureau Chief, Engineer Rakesh Patel, Engineer and Co-Exemption Coordinator Dan Murray, Engineer and Exemption Coordinator Alex Sadat, From the Bureau of Solid Waste Compliance and Enforcement, we have Bureau Chief Tom Farrell, Case Manager Paul Smith, and we also have people from different DEP programs that are assisting our rule team, including Carol Mercer with the Solid Waste Compliance and Enforcement, Steve Boyer with the N.J.A.C Stormwater Permitting and Water Quality Management, Eleanor Krakowski with the Bureau of Non-Point Pollution Control, Larry C. with our Air Enforcement Group, and Danny Wong with the Bureau of Stationary Sources. Next slide. In continuing the welcome, I'd like to remind you of a few different points regarding Microsoft Team logistics for this meeting. For the chat function, we're going to be having a staff member monitoring the chat in case you type in comments and questions, especially of a technical nature throughout the presentation. With the raise your hand function, we're asked that you raise your hand if you have a comment or question. After each presenter concludes the presentation, we'll have a question and answer slide. When that is displayed, I'll select a person to speak based upon when their hand went up. When you're selected to speak, please unmute your mic and lower your hand, and then we can have our discussion. In the interest of time, we are going to have a staff member interject in the discussion with a cue to keep us on schedule. If we start talking too long about a particular issue, we could always move that to another stakeholder meeting or just another phone call or letter afterwards. Also, in the interest of time, we're going to have a staff member make sure that we stay within the time allotted so that we will be able to cover everything. That staff member will wrap up the discussion and move on to the next presentation. Throughout this stakeholder meeting today, we're going to be having poll questions, and you'll be able to see those posted, links to those poll questions posted in the chat throughout the presentations. We want to keep track of your opinions, and we found that this is pretty much the best way in the virtual world for us to be able to find out exactly what you think. We're going to do it with poll questions that appear in the chat. They'll appear as a link, and when you click on that link, you'll be redirected to the main question sheets. We ask that at that link that you would type your name and affiliation before making a comment within that section. And to ensure accurate notes, we ask that you please type in full and complete sentences. For specific poll questions that have A, B, and C multiple choice options, you can vote by selecting an option and then clicking Submit Vote. You can change your vote as many times as you like, but only your final choice is going to be recorded. The poll question function will be open for answering for the next 24 hours. Next slide. The goals of this meeting today are simple. We want to hear from you, the industry experts, and our local and county partners on how we can improve our rules on the recycling exemptions. Our experience is that the final product is often far superior if inputs received from individuals with diverse perspectives. As our moderator, I will provide direction to ensure that all of you present have an opportunity to provide your input and comment, and I'll be also keeping us on track. Next slide. Today's topics of discussion will be closed loop anaerobic digestion, food waste transfer, demonstration projects, a recap of microscale food waste composting and community gardens, and a recap of small-scale outdoor and indoor food waste composting. With that, I would like to introduce Tom Farrell, who's going to be talking about our first topic, anaerobic digestion.
Thank you, Judy. Next slide, please. So we're looking at possibly introducing a new exemption using anaerobic digestion. It can be a very valuable means to reduce food waste. So anaerobic digestion of recyclable food scraps, manure, and other biodegradable Class C materials are what we're going to be looking at. They generate usable natural gas, which is predominantly methane, and they slow the reduction of landfill space. Next slide, please. So what materials would this exemption allow to be processed in the digester? While limited by the operations manual provided by each manufacturer of an anaerobic digester, in general, such systems, when operated properly, can digest the following food stocks without incident: produce, dairy, meats, manure, and fats or oils from food. Next slide, please. So EPA states that almost 3 times, or a little bit more than 3 times, of methane gas can be generated as compared to biosolids, and several more times than that than cow manure alone. So that's why food waste is encouraged, not just because it reduces landfill space, but because it can generate valuable energy. Next slide, please. What materials is the department considering to prohibit in the digester? So notwithstanding any inclusion or omission from the manufacturer's specifications, the department is considering prohibiting the following from being processed in an anaerobic digester, subject to this exemption: grease or oils not derived from food or plants, solvents, chemicals, or hazardous wastes, materials that would otherwise be solid waste if not processed in a digester or otherwise could not be recycled. Next slide, please. So here's a schematic of a full-scale anaerobic digester. Of course, they require permits, and we're looking at a smaller scale where a full-blown recycling permit would not be required. Rather, you would have an exemption. So just I put this up here so for those who are not familiar with anaerobic digestion, what the benefits are. And Aaron, I'm going to request control just so I can use my cursor. Okay, so here's your digester right here in the middle. So the process is, some pre-processing to grind up whatever you're putting in, whether that's agricultural waste, wasted food, which is EPA's new term. They don't like to say food waste anymore. Biosolids and organic wastewater can go into your preprocessor to break it up to fit appropriately into the anaerobic digester. Now, the good stuff is the biogas, but it's mixed with some impurities. So we want to get the methane out, the natural gas out, and distributed for generation of electricity, for combined heat and power systems, or directly to use for fuel. We can pipe it right into the natural gas pipeline network. But you have to get out some of those impurities, namely hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. You also have some residuals in the form of solid sludges and liquid products. And with the appropriate controls in place, they may be able to be used for beneficial purposes, such as fertilizer. All right, I'm going to stop control and give it back to you, Aaron. And next slide, please. So let's talk about what you think. A possible new exemption for this food waste processing is, something that requires a lot of your input. So what would be a good frequency of operator training? Your choices are A, once per year, B, each time a new operator is assigned, C, once every 5 years, D, within 1 year of startup, or E, other. Now, if you check in the chat, you can click on the link and there you can answer the question. And I thought we'd give you about a minute, but rest assured that if that's not enough time, we're keeping this presentation open for 24 hours and you can access it and answer then. But your first impulse are usually most valuable for us. So please try to answer those questions now. I'll start my timer for 1 minute. We'll have a 1 minute delay while you're answering that question. Okay, again, this will be available for you to answer these questions within the next 24 hours. So if you didn't have time to do it now, you should be able to do it at your leisure within the next 24 hours. And I think we'll go to the next slide, please. Limitations under consideration continued. Question 2. What should the department consider as documentation of adequate training? A, certificate from manufacturer, B, certificate from widely recognized association accepted by the United States Composting Council. C, self-certification using the department's form. Or D, other. All right, I'll give you 1 minute to answer this. And if you go in the chat and click on the link. Next slide, please. Question 3, although existing air regulations at N.J.A.C 7:27 require that the subject digesters have an air permit with specific emission limitations, an appropriate buffer distance from the digester and its supporting equipment should be no less than what? A, 50 feet from the property line, B, 100 feet from the property line, C, 500 feet from the property line, D, other. Give you 1 minute to respond. Okay, next slide, please. Question 4. The anaerobic digester shall not receive more than what? A, 1 ton of material per day, B, the daily throughput of materials identified in the manufacturer's specifications, C, the lesser of selections A and B above, D, other. I'll give you 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 5, materials to be processed in the digester shall be added to it, A, within 24 hours upon receipt, B, within 24 hours upon receipt if immediately placed in gas-tight containers, C, within 48 hours upon receipt if immediately placed in gas-tight containers, D, within 1 week upon receipt if immediately placed in gas-tight containers, E, other. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 6. The biosolids collected within the digester shall be A, available for immediate placement in a garden for nutrient-rich residual material, B, managed as a solid waste depending upon their classification, C, available for recycled uses if sufficient analysis confirms such use as appropriate, D, discarded in the solid waste dumpster, E, subjected to a beneficial use determination pursuant to N.J.A.C 7:26-1.7G, F, other. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 7, unless otherwise specified by the air permit, the anaerobic digester system shall be tested for tightness and performance at a frequency of A, which is dependent upon the presence of odors, B, once per month, C, once per quarter, D, as needed but no less than monthly, E, as needed but no less than annually, F, other. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 8. The anaerobic digester system should contain A or N alarm system or systems that address A, hydrogen sulfide gas emissions, B, temperature, C, water level, D, pressure, E, all of the above, F, other. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Judy, I'll push it off to you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you so much for your presentation. At this point, we would like to ask if any of you have any questions or would like to discuss the topic that we just went over with the biogas digesters. Please raise your hand and we'll call on you to talk. Okay, first up, we have Jay Fisher.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I guess my biggest question is, what size digester are we going to determine is going to be exempt from the regulation?
Tom?
Sure, I'll address that. So, Jay, nice to hear from your voice again. We are debating what that is, and part of what this exercise we're doing right now is trying to get input on figuring that out.
Okay, so my concern is I've been to digesters throughout the US of varying sizes, and I've also been to facilities over in Europe. Regardless of what system it is, the feedstocks that are coming in are all going to be odorous. So right off the bat, you know, when we start talking about distance to property lines and those kind of things, we need to really be careful, because even though it is an enclosed system, they are still prone to having odor issues, A, with incoming feedstocks, B, processing problems or conditions that arise that can cause odors. And then lastly, that product, that end product that's coming out of a digester can also be very odorous, should definitely be tested. So I really think we need to have a really good handle on, you know, are we talking about a smaller system, almost like the company that makes a rocket, where it's going to be small, can run a kitchen, or maybe a little bit larger, like a grocery store facility or warehouse? Or are we talking, you know, a very large facility? You know me, I'm not a big, you know, government intervention, big government permit guy, but I would be very reluctant to allow almost anything without having some type of oversight.
Understood.
Right, Jay. This is Karen Clue. The exemptions all have a theme, right? They're all considered small scale. So this is during our discussions and educating ourselves on the digesters, we are not talking about a big commercial unit. We are thinking more of a small institutional size at a max, but nothing like the one in Elizabeth or anything like that. A larger unit would require a full-blown Class C permit.
So were you considering something like the unit that Dr. Nick had put together when he was at Kane? Now, obviously that wasn't an anaerobic digester, but it was a mid-sized unit that would handle the college facility. Is that kind of what you guys are envisioning?
Yeah, something that would handle maybe not just a single source, but an institutional source, like a restaurant, like maybe a corporate campus, something like that. So a lot would have to do with the manufacturer's specifications, of course, because I understand there's different size units that accept different volumes of material. But again, we're not talking a scale like Waste Management's digester in Elizabeth, that produces power that goes to the grid. This is more self-sustaining.
Jay, do you have any further questions?
I do. So would that facility be allowed to take material in from off-site, or would it be strictly material that was self-generated?
Right now, we are looking at self-generated material. But when I say self-generated, so perhaps we would consider a corporate campus where the digester services multiple buildings, but all within a single campus. So no, we're not looking at a big commercial unit that would accept material commercially. That's not the idea here.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. Next up is Isaac Berg. Is that how you pronounce? I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. From N.J.A.C.
Yeah, it's Berg, but that's close enough. So I just wanted to make a couple quick comments. As we're thinking about the size that Jay rightly points out, one of the things that we have seen in other states is the idea of a registered site versus an exempt site versus a permitted site. And so, it's possible that a registered site having a lot less onerous, requirements than would a permitted site, but still has to provide some information and things like that. So the DEP is sort of aware of what's going on and things of that nature. So that's just something we might think about, depending on what the size of these types of operations are. If it's, larger than a community garden, but smaller than a landfill, then that could be a way to look at it. And we also strongly encourage the department to think about the end uses. In particular, are we processing it into a product that can be used properly and is tested and things of that nature. So those are just my comments.
Thank you, Isaac. Is there anyone else?
Yeah, just to address Isaac's first part of Isaac's comment. So the exemption is kind of a confusing word in recycling world. All that means is that they are exempt from the requirement to obtain a full-blown approval or permit. There is a notification to the department required to operate an exempt activity. So the digester would be no exception. They would have to provide notification to us, the county and the municipality, prior to beginning operations. So it's not an exclusion from the rules, it's an exemption from the requirement to obtain a permit if they fall within the limitations as set forth in the exempt requirements at 1.4a.
Karen, thank you for that clarification. Does anyone have any further questions on biogas and digesters? Assuming not, we're going to press on forward. I'd like to introduce Alex Sadat, who's going to be talking about food waste transfer.
Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Sadat, and I'm an environmental engineer in the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management. I am also the primary exemption coordinator for the Bureau and handle the processing and management of all exempt recycling facilities in the state. Today, I'll be speaking to you all about a potentially new exemption we have crafted during our rulemaking discussions as it relates to food waste transfer. Next slide, please. The prime motivator for this exemption is that upon discussion, we realize that we already have exemptions that are related to the receipt, storage, and transfer of materials. For example, Class B materials such as tires, concrete, brick, block, and asphalt are included in current exemptions 5 and 7, while Class C materials such as leaves are covered by current exemption 19. Furthermore, universal waste are covered by current exemptions 14 and 15. In our eyes, it therefore makes sense for food waste to have a transfer-related exemption for itself, as become an initiative of the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management to encourage food waste recycling as much as possible in the state. Next slide, please. The ultimate final destination of the food waste to be transferred must be considered a legitimate entity by the department. These legitimate entities include the following destinations: a Department of Agriculture approved livestock producer who is authorized to accept food waste, or an approved or exempt Class C recycling facility that is authorized to accept source-separated food waste. The latter option helps provide authorized food waste recyclers add to their supply chain, thus further enhancing food waste recycling in the state of New Jersey. This is consistent with the new food waste recycling laws recently passed in the state. Next slide, please. While this process is exempt from recycling regulations, it should be further stressed that this activity is not exempt from the regulations that concern other programs in the department. Such food waste transfer processes are thus prone to creating odors that are deleterious to public health. Therefore, it would be required that all operations associated with this exemption be conducted within a fully enclosed building that is equipped with an air management system permitted by the department pursuant to N.J.A.C. 7:27 that is capable of removing dust, noxious compounds, and odors. Furthermore, all incoming shipments would have to be received in closed containers. Next slide, please. It should be stressed again that this activity is not exempt from regulations found in other programs of the department. Just as it is not exempt from the air program regulations, it is also not exempt from the stormwater regulations. As a means to avoid stormwater runoff of leachate that would be hazardous, all consolidation activities must take place in a large container, and under no circumstances should the food waste be tipped onto the floor of the building for any purpose whatsoever. Next slide, please. In terms of repackaging and consolidation activities, non-food waste materials found in loads, such as non-biodegradable plastic bags, will be removed during consolidation or repackaging, and all non-food waste would then have to be disposed of at a permanent solid waste facility. All food waste and non-food waste material during this activity should be stored in containers that are structurally sound and do not have leakage, spillage, or visible damage to them. Next slide, please. Then, using a DEP form that we will have crafted, the volumes of both incoming and outgoing materials would be recorded for record. These records would be kept for 3 years. Next slide, please. Now, we would like some feedback from the audience. Please answer the following poll questions, and I'll give you guys a minute, just like Tom did.
So, Alex, it might be helpful to read the question.
Yeah, of course. So, question 9 is, what should the minimum buffer distance be between food waste transfer buildings and the property line? The potential answers are A, 0 feet, B, 25 feet, C, 50 feet, and D, other, where you can type in the answer. Question 10 is the following. How many cubic yards of material should be allowed to be stored at any one time? Answers are A, 50 cubic yards, B, 100 cubic yards, C, 500 cubic yards, D, 1,000 cubic yards, and E, other, where you can type in your answer. All right, next slide, please. Now, for the next question, which is question 11, what should the time limit be on food waste storage? Would it be A, 24 hours, B, 48 hours, C, 72 hours, or D, other, where you can type in your answer, and I'll give you all a minute. All right, and next slide, please. So I guess this is where I hand it back off to Judy.
Yes.
Yep, you got it, Alex. Thank you so much. I'd like to open up the floor if anybody has any questions. What we'll do is raise your hand, and we'll go in the order in which you've raised it. First, we have Nick Smith-Sebasto. I hope I got the last name right.
You did, Andrea, just fine. It's I have more of a comment than a question, and it concerns the way the questions are phrased. It makes them very, very difficult to answer. I'm kind of dovetailing Jay's concerns in the earlier section. Just asking how long should the food waste be allowed to be stored really is an unanswerable question, because we need to know the circumstances about how it's stored. For example, I have direct firsthand experience storing food for 2 weeks in sealed containers and refrigerated boxes. That was fine. I also have direct firsthand experience of storing food at ambient temperatures in sealed containers. And in that case, 48 hours is really kind of the limit. It really gets pretty smelly after that. So I think that the questions need to be expanded upon to include the environmental conditions under which the food is being stored before we can give an intelligent response to the duration.
Okay, feel free to type in additional information. You can choose one and say 2 weeks in closed seal container, or feel free to add that information into the chat. Again, we're kind of limited on how we phrase these poll questions, so they are not intended to be exclusive answers. Like if you have some nuances or caveats that you want to add, we welcome the feedback.
Nick, do you have anything further?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you much. Next is Jay Fisher.
Hello again. I concur with Dr. Nick. I think one of the things I'd really like to see from the DEP all around is a little more fluidness and a little less rigidity in a lot of these permit structures, and here's why. So I'm located in Sussex County on a very rural location. I've got over a half-mile buffer to any receptor, any neighbor, any business. So the way I handle incoming food waste, when it comes in by me, we blend it with carbon materials and kind of start a pre-process. So I think I have much more flexibility in the time, retention time, and process time versus somebody who's in the heart of Newark, in an industrial building, surrounded by neighbors. So I really would like to see a little more flexibility built into some of this permitting questions and the final design. These situations are going to be very different. You get and again, it goes back to size. Are we talking about like a bicycle collection? And one of the comments I heard was said by the speaker was that they were not going to allow material to be dumped on a tipping room floor. And I found that a little concerning, especially for, facilities that are in more city type areas. So say you start a small scale collection route, even if it's a bicycle route, they bring it to a facility in Newark, they dump it on the floor, but they're going to transport it to somebody like myself. Again, I think that restriction, I think it should be more flexibility. I think, we shouldn't just outright say you can't dump it on a floor to transfer it. I think each situation needs to be looked at differently.
Okay, Jay, thank you for your input. We'll definitely be taking a note of that. Karen, do you have a response?
No, I mean, that's always a great idea, right? So,
and remember, we're talking about the exemptions here. So this is
right.
more of a more restricted volume type situation where you're not qualifying for a permit. Like you haven't reached that level of whether it be by volume or by the amount that you have throughput per day. It's more of the, well, this is what, if you have this or less, then you don't need a permit.
Right, the department has to establish some criteria by which it's a bright line. Below, you don't need a permit, above, you do. And it's really hard in regulation, as you can imagine, to say, okay, well, you can have this much if you have this and this control and this much buffer and this much property. Regulations are the framework by which the department manages oversight of facilities. It's difficult or impossible to kind of write regulations that envision every possible scenario. So keep in mind, again, these exemptions are designed for small scale operations that don't need a permit from solid waste and are the criteria by which you fall below, you don't need one, you go above, you do. So we do have to somehow choose a number that makes sense.
Thanks, Karen. Jay, do you have any other further question?
I go back to my dumping on a tipping floor. I have a specific vendor in mind that is doing bicycle collection, then bringing it to his facility and transferring it into a larger truck to bring to compost facilities. So, and he is on a smaller scale. I mean, I would definitely say, he's not any kind of larger scale operation. So can somebody answer specifically about the thought of, dumping on a tipping floor to transfer?
We don't even allow, well, I think we're trying to be careful here that this doesn't become a transfer station, right? Which has a whole different set of regulations. So, and we're also concerned because of the odors associated with food waste to really manage that. So this exemption idea, and again, this is brand new, it's just an idea, was designed to allow, more efficient movement of food waste around the state to encourage recycling, but not to replace transfer stations.
Do you guys have a number in mind? Like, was it like a ton a week, a 10 ton a week? Do we have a starting point?
We have been talking about it, but we would welcome your ideas because, again, we are always looking at these from an environmental protection perspective. We don't know the business side. So we don't want to pass an exemption that nobody can use because it's way too small or totally impractical. And that's, again, what we're after here during these stakeholder meetings.
Okay, very good.
All right, thank you, Jay. The next person who had his hand up was Gary Vondermeyer.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification, perhaps, Karen. I think under the existing regulatory code, a municipality, for instance, can operate a convenience center and accept source-separated food and then bring it and feed it to a Class C facility. And I really think that's kind of where you're going here in sort of a broader scope and broader perspective. Do I have that right? And that there would be some form of, as Isaac was mentioning earlier, some type of a registration or some kind of a link where you know about these places, because I really do support this. I think it's a great idea to improve the transportation economics and to foster more food waste recycling.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And we've heard from people that want to start a business and pick up the food and consolidate it and either compost it themselves or bring it somewhere to be composted. And right now there's no mechanism for them to do that. And again, the exemptions, all the exemptions require notification to the department and to the municipality and to the county. So we will know where they are, as well as our municipal and county counterparts.
Great, thank you. I think this is great.
Thank you, Gary. Next up, we have Jairo Gonzalez from N.J.A.C.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see me? Okay, sounds like a movie. Anyway, so yeah, I'm with the New Jersey Composting Council, and in reference to this transfer, we have been seeing these micro haulers, similar to what Jay was talking about. Most of them are members of the council, and the way they are working through some of these ways to transfer the material to further locations is by using convenience centers that the municipalities are kind of working together with them. These are small, of course, a very small scale, but everybody that we've seen is using the format of biofilters in their containers, be either the 5-gallon buckets that are being picked up at the curbside and then transferring them over to 48 or 64s, or even big buckets, 4 and 10 yarders. But they're all using the biofilter. I don't see this being put on the floor. And so it's one of the practices that we teach to maintain, regardless of the size of the operation. We're talking here micro haulers and micro community-based operations, and where they're using the basics of performance-based, which is to use biofilters and container. So you transfer from one container to the next container, and then you hold either 48 hours or the 72 hours, as Nick pointed out, subject to the environmental conditions. In the winter, you can hold it. In the summers, you might not want to, and so forth. But then you transfer them over. So that's one of the comments that we've seen right now. It's happening in the state with several of the micro haulers and several of these convenience centers who now I can see them expanding and utilizing the space of the transfer stations, which would be ideal to provide more infrastructure to haul to these final sites. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jairo. Next, we have Nick Smith-Sebasto.
Okay, just me again. I just wanted to reinforce something that Jay said, and it was a feeling that I perceived as I was trying to answer some of the questions, and that is kind of a disconnect between the subject and the questions. For example, my understanding is we were talking about small or micro scale operations, and yet the available response options seem to me like they would be more appropriate for much larger operations. So I don't know if, I don't want to speak for Jay, but I get the sense that he was kind of feeling the same thing that I was feeling, that maybe if we could fine tune those connections, these types of questions or comments might not be coming forward. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick. Next up, we have Ann Moore. Ann, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, it's actually Wayne Defeo, but I wanted to echo.
Oh, hi, Wayne.
How are you?
Good, you?
I wanted to echo the comment that we're talking about micro facilities like the one we approved in Newark. They're limited by what they can accept. They're looking at 1 to 3 cubic yards total at the whole site. And so the micro transfer is fine. When you're talking about micro transfer like you're doing in West Orange, as Nick points out, we're talking 5-gallon buckets being transferred, and Jairo pointed out as well, into 64-gallon carts that are sealed. This, I would agree with Nick, we're going way above and beyond into a food waste transfer operation for which we have models, such as the leaf transfer, yard waste transfer, grass transfer operation, and we have the exempt status for those. That's a very different scale we're talking about here. We're trying to first streamline this to help the local community gardens. We can, Nick's right on point, let's ratchet this down a little bit. And you need 2 sets of rules, effectively. A micro, and then you need food waste transfer. 2 different things.
Wayne, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any further comments, or anyone on DEP staff have anything further to add? Okay, I think we're probably ready to move on. With that, I would like to introduce Dan Murray, who's going to be talking about demonstration projects for exemptions qualifications.
All right, thank you very much, Judy. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Murray. I'm an environmental engineer with the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management. Today, I'm going to talk about a potentially new exemption to the recycling regulations for demonstration projects. As it has been mentioned, any information displayed is meant to facilitate discussion. No final decisions are expressed or implied. With that, let me begin by saying that this new section is designed to encompass demonstration projects that seek exemption from the general recycling facility requirements. The main topics I'll be discussing are the basis for this exemption, their requirements, and the limitations that'll be imposed. One thing to note is this proposed exemption is separate from the existing RD&D requirements in the solid waste regs. The solid waste RD&D requirements, which stand for research, development, and demonstration, those intend to lead those projects into permitted solid waste operations. However, the projects that I'll be discussing today, we intend to lead into future exempt operations. Next slide, please. So the basis for the exemption, why are we proposing this? We have found there's an interest in our state for small-scale recycling that does not fall under the current exemption framework at 1.4a and would otherwise not be authorized under these other exemptions. An alternative option would be to apply for and receive a recycling center general approval, but that requires application procedures that may not be reasonable for these small-scale operations. If we are proposing to include a new subsection to the exemptions, which we are defining as subsection E, it would allow entities to be able to perform small-scale recycling activities by gathering relevant data to demonstrate that they can be conducted in an environmentally sound manner. Next slide, please. So the requirements that we're considering for these demonstration projects under this exemption are unlike most of the existing exemptions, which require an operator to submit a notification of exempt activities to us. For these demonstration projects, we're considering that a review be conducted, and with this, we're considering an application be submitted with an accompanying review fee. Some additional requirements in this application is a site plan, map showing the locations of the project, a project description, which might include a process flow diagram, a listing of the materials and their throughput capacity, and other specific operating parameters. The application would also require an outline describing the need for the project and a description of the measures taken to minimize and control environmental impacts, such as noise, odor, air quality, traffic, and stormwater runoff. Next slide, please. Now that we've covered the application requirements, let's talk about some of the limitations we're considering on these projects. First of all, we're considering to set a fixed time limit on demonstration projects for 1 year. However, in certain instances where the applicant can prove that an extension is needed to collect additional data, the department may grant an extension, provided that the project activities can be conducted in an environmentally sound manner with no public health impacts. Next slide, Aaron. Some additional limitations are that these projects must be conducted in accordance with all environmental statutes applicable to each project. Also, since we are considering that projects under this exemption receive a written letter of approval, they must also operate in accordance with all specific conditions in that letter of approval. Next slide. Furthermore, other possible requirements is that if the demonstration project is proven to be successful, then there's a need for the operator to develop a mechanism which allows for continued operation and also establish a pathway to include this operation under future exemptions. Next slide. And now we would like to ask a couple poll questions to get feedback from you guys. Question number 12 asks, what should the maximum daily throughput be for a project to be considered small scale under this operation? Your choices are A, 1 cubic yard a day, B, 5 cubic yards a day, C, 50 cubic yards a day, or D, other? Type in your answer. I will give you guys about a minute to answer this question, and I'll move on to question 13. All right, question 13. Should there be a minimum daily limit placed on the throughput capacity for small-scale demonstration projects under this exemption? Your choices here are just A, yes, or B, no. Okay, moving on to question 14. Since I mentioned that the demonstration projects will require an application that requires department review, what amount of review fee do you think should be assessed on these applications? Your options are A, less than $1,000, B, greater than $1,000, or C, other. Please type in your answer. Okay, can you move to the next slide, please? All right, thank you all for your time. Let me reintroduce you guys to Judy, who will be moderating the Q&A section for this topic.
Hello, we're back to Q&A. As it started, I see that Wayne Defeo had asked a question, how can a community garden afford any fees? I don't know if there's anyone on DEP staff that would like to entertain that one.
So we will be getting to the community garden composting exclusion next. So hopefully we can delay answering that question to the next presentation.
All right. Next up is Gary Vondermeyer.
Thank you very much. Two quick questions for clarifications. I'm not sure, Daniel, if I heard any link to county planning, because like the RD&D, I believe, is treated through the administrative action vehicle, which that generally is a letter from the solid waste coordinator as opposed to the full-blown plan amendment process. So can you sort of clarify what you were thinking, if anything, related to county planning? And the second piece is I think the RD&D vehicle, and this will be sort of an adjunct to that, I think they're terrific. They're one of the most progressive things that the department has in the code. The one place where I've seen problems come up is interagency issues. So the solid waste program will approve an RD&D, but then there'll be an involvement from air or water that will negate that. Is there a way of, like, what's your thought on how we coordinate that in the future so it's truly an RD&D or, in this case, a pilot or demonstration exemption that's workable? So two parts, county planning and then interagency coordination. Sorry, that was a bit much.
Dan, do you have this or you want me to jump in?
You can jump in, Karen.
So none of the exemptions, with the exception of one, require county plan approval. Okay. So if we follow that model, we do not anticipate a county plan approval process as part of this demonstration project exemption. Again, the whole idea is to keep it small scale, show us it works, and then we will extend it, allow others to also demonstrate their success with it, and then perhaps undertake rulemaking to make it a permanent exemption. So hopefully that answers question one.
Yes.
Question two about the coordination. I wasn't honestly aware that some of these RD&Ds bump up against multi-agency problems. We wrestle with all the programs trying to deal with new and innovative approaches. And as you probably know, the Office of Permit Navigation has been put in place in order to put all the programs in a room with a proposed operator to try and allow them the facts, you know, to plan on what permits would be required and not. But I'm not sure I have experience. I know I don't have experience with kind of outside the agency coordination being an issue.
No, I mean within the department.
Oh.
Yes, within the department is what I meant. I didn't mean outside agencies. You know, I know of a couple cases where solid waste issues RDD approvals, and then later AIR came in with very, very draconian requirements that wound up negating the whole thing. And it'd be nice to coordinate that stuff up front is really the point, to the extent possible, so that if solid waste issues this exemption, you're done. You know, and that's it. You can run and do your exemption and be done with it, and you know, complete the process. That's really the point, Karen. Just to keep within the agency close coordination. But thank you. You answered the first question perfectly.
Great. Gary, do you have anything else?
I do not. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you much. I'd like to call on Christine Paff from Ag Choice. Hi, Christine.
Hello. Can we get an example of a demonstration project? It was very difficult to answer the questions without knowing exactly what you're envisioning with the demonstration project.
So it's kind of interesting you ask that. Like, we don't know what we don't know, right? So the whole idea here is that the recycling and especially composting has such a spotlight on it now, right? And we just don't want to be the impediment to something that we haven't thought of yet. So that's the idea here. Again,
and being able to embrace new technology. I mean, because we don't know if there's a new way that composting might become available that isn't something that's really thought about in our exemptions, but it's something that might fit. So it would allow for the evolvement of composting to be able, or any of the other exemption focuses, to be able to embrace a new technology, to test it to see if it might work, and to see if that might be a potential for a future exemption.
Okay, yeah, that wasn't clear in the beginning, so it was kind of hard to answer questions about volumes and throughput and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
Yeah, the questions are really intended to kind of spur discussion. They're not, in some ways, especially these, because we don't even have an idea of what we're talking about future possible technologies. It's really hard to talk about limitations. So, but I think the idea, again, because these are going to be exempt from the requirement to obtain a permit, that the scale, we're talking generally small scale.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you much, Christine. Next up is Isaac Berg from N.J.A.C.
Thanks. So yeah, just a couple quick things to think about. It was not terribly clear to me what needs to be shown in order to sort of move to the next step, if you will. So you do your 1-year demonstration project, and then it would be very helpful if somebody going into the project knows, okay, I need to show X, Y, and Z in order to move forward. And then also thinking along those lines, what does the process look like sort of between my RD&D and the next step? So it's 1 year. I've submitted my data. I'm able to continue operating now, or sort of how does that process go while DEP is considering the data and things of that nature? So I would just ask that and at least ask it be thought of. Thanks.
Those are really, really good questions, and we have been wrestling with that issue on the rule team, and we do have a Deputy Attorney General kind of looking at the question. Me being eternally optimistic, I thought, maybe we can somehow squeeze this in without a rulemaking effort, but I don't think that's going to happen. but the department will have the discretion to allow a successful project to continue while rulemaking is undertaken. But we would probably want to see more than one person undertake that particular technology. So we have a track record and that shows. But as far as what data would need to be collected, that would be really project specific. So obviously our concern is always impact on the environment and human health. So those would be some of the metrics that we would be looking at. But I think the proposal would need to come in with some ideas on what they are looking to achieve, and then that could help determine what data is necessary to be submitted to for the department to determine quote unquote success.
All right, thank you. Before we move on to our next speaker, we had a note in the chat from Jairo Gonzalez and N.J.A.C stating, I would assume the R&D 1 year can help part of the DEP higher education grant. Jairo, would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, again, can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
So, oh, here we go. Change.
We
find
can't see you, I don't think, but we can hear you.
Okay, so we find this R&D 1 year very exciting because there is a grant that the DEP has out there for higher education, and we've seen that in the past this lack of 1 year exemption has put a damper on some of the projects that could have been for demonstration purposes that would have included environmental and social demonstration, as well as feasibility studies on the feedstocks, et cetera, et cetera. So we really think that the 1 year will help the grant provide some of these projects that in the past, because of lack of space and lack of licenses and permits and all that stuff, have been put on the shelf, and that's been a damper. That's what I wanted to mention. And pretty much along with Christina was asking what kind of projects. I think that's one clear project that R&D can help us out with.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate the comment. Our next speaker, Wayne Defeo.
Hi again. First of all, I want to thank Karen for your comment about being specific and needing data points, because that is one of the things I was going to raise. I think in the primary review for any of these facilities, whether they're RD&D or other, it should be based on performance, not any kind of arbitrary metric. Are they controlling odor? Is there a runoff problem? Are they making a product, and can they market it? Those are the 4 primary issues. That's it. Everything else becomes almost superfluous. And they should be, in a question like this, for RD&D or this one, if those 4 standards are met, I'm not sure what else we really need to look at. So I just leave it out there as keep it simple is what I'm trying to get to and what you're trying to do here. The more complicated you make these exemptions beyond the 4 performance standards, the more difficult they will be for anyone to do. That's it. But I appreciate that you need a lot of data, and that is definitely a challenge when you've got attorneys involved.
Wayne, thank you so much for your comment and your insight. We appreciate that. Anyone from DEP, do we have any feedback for Wayne, or?
Odors, runoff, market for product. What was the 4th performance standard, Wayne?
Is odor, market for the product, runoff. What the hell did I say? Thank God you're recording it.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant.
It's been a long day already. What did I say? Runoff, odor.
Wayne, you were saying, are they making a product? Is there a market for a product, odor, and runoff?
Yeah, that was it. Thank you. Thank you.
I was going to say we could always go and check back at 1 hour 43. All right. Is there anyone else who would like to provide any feedback or spur discussion? If not, then we're going to be moving on to our next topic. Our next topic is from Karen Clue with the proposed exclusion for microscale food waste composting.
Thank you. Again, my name is Karen Clue. I'm the Chief of the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management. I was going to just recap a summary of the potential new exclusion for microscale food waste composting. This information is similar to information that was presented at a previous stakeholder meeting, so I will run through this quickly. The idea here is N.J.A.C. 7:26A-1.1 excludes certain activities from the scope of the recycling rules, whereby the exemptions at 1.4 exempt activities from the requirement to obtain a permit. So that's kind of the difference. What we're talking about here is a complete exclusion. If you fall within the limitations as set forth in the exclusion, then you fall out of the recycling rules altogether. For example, at 1.1e, that excludes composting and on-site use of farm feedstocks. So we're modeling the microscale food waste composting exclusion after that. So again, similarly, we plan to propose adding a paragraph at 1.1f to exclude microscale food waste composting. Next slide, please. So we're proposing to exclude microscale food waste composting for a variety of reasons. Number one, the department received a petition for rulemaking requesting food waste composting exemption. Under the current regulations, even the smallest amount of food waste composting would require a Class C approval if they were going to accept off-site food waste for composting and use the finished compost on-site and off-site. So the department wants to encourage urban residential communities to source, separate, and compost food waste to reduce disposal of materials as solid waste. Given the small size of the operation, the department believes that the potential impacts to the environment and neighboring properties would be minimal. Next slide, please. So we're hoping that many different organizations may benefit from this exclusion, including community gardens, which was the example for which we received the rulemaking petition, multifamily dwellings in urban areas, because currently single-family residents enjoy a complete exclusion from the rules for backyard composting. Nonprofit groups such as Boy Scouts and perhaps school environmental clubs could benefit from this exclusion. Next slide, please. The proposed exclusion would allow for the smallest quantities of food waste and the lowest throughput capacities. The department plans to propose no more than 2 cubic yards per week of source-separated food waste to be received. The proposed language will require operations to be managed to minimize odors, contact water, fire, and scavenging by wildlife. The composting operation must be conducted within a container, such as a bin. Also, to minimize odors and vectors, the department will propose operational requirements, such as material handling, like by the end of each operating day, all incoming source separated food waste shall be introduced into the composting container. Next slide, please. Also, to minimize potential odor and pest problems in the neighborhood, the department plans to propose restricting the material to only vegetative food waste. Meat, fat, oil, grease, bone, and dairy products will be specifically excluded. The operation will be allowed to accept food waste generated in the community, including by residents, small businesses, and schools located within the community. We are going to rely on the common definition of community. We wrestled with defining it for the purposes of this rule and could not come up with a better definition than the commonly used term. Since the operator will be responsible for the quality of incoming material, education and outreach to those participating in the community will be necessary. The operator must certify that the property owner consents to the compost operation. The owner of the property shall be held responsible for the removal of all materials in the event that the composting operation is not successful or ceases operation. Next slide, please. Since this was a recap and we already asked the poll questions during the previous stakeholder meetings, I haven't prepared additional poll questions, but we would like to open the floor now with Judy moderating to discuss or answer any questions about this exclusion.
All right, thanks, Karen. First up, we have Nick Smith-Sabasto.
Oh, thank you. Karen, could you please just repeat, did you say 2 or 3 yards a week is what you were operationally defining as a microscale?
We are talking about 2 cubic yards per week.
Okay, so you're talking about roughly 1,500 pounds a week. And then it said it's going to have to be inside of a container. Can you operationally define what you mean by container?
I believe we do define it in the rule proposal, but of course, off the top of my head, I don't recall what that definition is. But I think the example that we have been exposed to is kind of the pallet example, or the bin example, where you have the 3 bins or the 3 pallets in a row. And I think what we're saying is we don't want it to occur on the ground, directly on the ground.
I think the focus is more of an enclosed structure. I think that was more of our take on it. Okay, so that's going to again use the term Jay used earlier about rigidness. That's going to exclude certain technologies that would allow you to do 1,500 pounds a week. It would allow meat, et cetera, to be composted. And so I'm not sure that the way things are currently phrased is taking into account, to the point that Judith made earlier about emerging technologies or technologies that are in existence. It seems to me like this is thinking only primitively, and I understand the disclaimers at the beginning about no endorsements, but everything I saw in the pictures were small static piles, perhaps aerated static piles. But there are other technologies available that can process the same amount, but are more sophisticated. So I wonder, has the department considered those? I would ask that if there is specific information that you would like to see or have us consider, please send us some sample language, because if we're missing some technological thing like what you're talking about, please send it to us and we'll take that under advisement to see if we can fit something similar into the rule.
Great, thank you.
Right, again, this idea is for kind of the low tech, really cheap, really small scale, to allow folks who don't have a lot of money to produce their own soil amendment. Rakesh will talk about exemptions that are different technologies that perhaps if somebody has the capital to invest in more sophisticated composting operations, they could fall under these exemptions rather than this exclusion.
All right, and Jay Fisher has noted in the chat that a 64-gallon toter can is approximately 1 cubic yard, just FYI. Our next speaker is Wayne Defeo.
Hi again. I think that the exemption is a great idea, and I didn't understand that when we were talking about the prior one, so I can see what you're doing is scaling this down or scaling it up, depending on how you want to look at that. The only 2 things I would make sure I ask on the exemption, on the exclusion, is on all of these, and I think, Karen, you already said the answer is yes, but I want to be sure, the county solid waste or recycling coordinators would be notified where these facilities are, correct? No matter what?
So absolutely for the exemptions. The exclusion, again, will be, these will be excluded from the recycling rules. I think we could introduce the need for county or local notifications, because ultimately, if there is an odor problem at one of these facilities, it would probably fall to the local officials under some nuisance ordinance to resolve.
Yeah, I would just suggest that if we could just, no fee, no nothing, not looking to charge them any money, just that if there's a list, we know where they are.
Okay.
We just for the point you just raised, if we get a nuisance complaint, and I'm going to say, I don't know what you're talking about, it doesn't exist. And then the only other element I would make on this is, of course, on this exclusion, there will be no fees to those doing this, correct?
Correct.
They will not need an air permit, they will not need a water permit, they will not need anything.
So I cannot speak to the air and water program requirements. The early in the slide presentation, we have the points of contact. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in pursuing this to contact them directly and get the answer from the horse's mouth.
Okay, well that's fair enough. And all I would say is anything that could be done either through Mark's office or through the commissioner's office, because obviously they have the power. They outrank you, right, Karen? Still.
Oh, absolutely.
They have the power to say, no, we're going to not do it this way. Because if you require something like a community garden, you get an air or a water permit, not you personally, but if the department requires that, it effectively undermines the goal you have here. Because you make it so they don't have any money. And the project in Newark, just as an observation, because it was new and didn't fall under any of this, the county waived any fees that they would have had to file for the county. We just worked them through it to get them moving. So that's all I would say on that. And I think otherwise it's very good, by the way. It should be commended.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. We appreciate that. Next speaker is Michelle.
Hi, this is Michelle Bradley from Java's Compost. I had two things. One, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just to follow up on what Wayne was saying. My understanding about what's going on in Newark is that they are being held up by air and water for a permit to take in material locally from that site. So that's just something that I wanted to bring up. Also, in terms of the technology for like a community garden or urban farm, if they're using like an ASP box, would those circumstances be allowed to take like meat and dairy, because those are designed to be rodent and animal proof?
So I think because this is an exclusion, I am no composting expert, but what I have found in my research is if composting is done correctly, then you should be able to take everything, right? But if things go awry, the problems associated with meat and dairy really exacerbate the problems really quickly. And it also calls into need the monitoring for temperature to ensure all pathogens are destroyed. So we did consider it, and pretty much for those two reasons, and probably a lot of others that I'm not remembering, we thought to be on the safe side that we would exclude meat and dairy for the exclusion. Again, things open up if you go for one of the other exemptions.
Okay. Yeah, I would just say, in terms of like the ASP micro bins, those temperatures get really hot, upwards of 140 degrees, which can kill pathogens. So, maybe there can be some, again, flexibility with if you're using a certain technology, maybe you're allowed to take additional material.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, Michelle, thanks so much for your question and your input. Next up is Gary Sondermeyer.
Thank you. Great, a little slow there. First, I just would like to chime in with Dr. Nick and others who said it would be great if we look at a broader expanse of feedstocks where possible. And Karen, I did hear what you say. I appreciate it and I understand, but I do think we should look as broadly as we can. Secondly, Wayne had brought up, and Michelle, the interagency coordination thing, and I mentioned that in a prior comment. I do think it's absolutely critical that we figure it out ahead of time and it not be a case-by-case thing, or it's going to wind up being counterproductive to what we're really trying to achieve. And I know it's hard. I know it's hard to do that because it's place-based, place-specific, but I think it's enormously important that the department, not just solid and hazardous waste, the department come out with a unified front on these exemptions. And the final thing, similarly, something like record keeping, I understand why we want record keeping. I personally love record keeping, but I think in the community garden, who's going to do the record keeping? And like some of this, whatever we look at, please let's be very practical so that it's feasible and it doesn't, sort of defeat the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Does anyone have anything else that they would like to discuss? Please raise your hand. Okay, we have Wayne Defeo. Wayne, are you going to speak to what has been going on in the chat?
Yeah. Well, just quickly on the meat and dairy, on the site in Newark, which I'm obviously familiar with, I'm all for that. I'm all for the ASP. I understand that ASP can handle much more than just vegetative, but given the proximity to property lines, we're talking 0 feet and 5 feet to a house. I really couldn't, and I can tell you right now, I'm anti-regulation in a lot of ways. In this case, I've actually worked with the operator and said no meat or dairy, and you've just got to, for now, for that size, for that type of community garden, no. We can go to the exemption ones, and you can go with other technologies, fully enclosed, aerated vessels, etc. But I would disagree that meat and dairy should be allowed in any of the excluded types of facilities. That's all.
Okay, Wayne, thank you for your input. I'd like to jump into the chat with a question about if material is generated on site, processed on site, and compost is used on site, whether the process is exempt. I'm going to ask Rakesh Patel to address that. And Rakesh, when you're done with the answer, I think we're going to be ready to move on to your point of presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. Yes, so under the current exemption, anything that has been generated on site can qualify for the exemptions. So you guys can apply for the exemptions at any location, whether it doesn't have to be educational institute.
Okay. All right, Rakesh, would you like to get started? Oop, we just had a question from Brian Constantino. Does DEP have a specific spec for what type of compost technology is acceptable under the micro exclusion? That is type of enclosure, outdoor piles on solid surfaces, etc.
No, we are trying to leave this as broad as possible to allow the most flexibility as possible. So our big limitation is the volume, and we do feel that if we control the volume, A, the potential impacts are minimized, but B, in the event things do go badly, cleanup could happen really quick. So that's pretty much our focus there. And back to Rakesh's comment, So there's a quirky thing in the existing rules where, yes, you can compost Class C materials generated on site, but currently the rules require use off-site. The product must be used off-site. So I still think that's a typo, but that's what the rules currently say. So that's one of the reasons we need to fix them.
All right, in the interest of time, we're running about 15 minutes behind, but there's been such great discussion today that is awesome. We really appreciate all of the interaction. With that, I'd like to reintroduce Rakesh Patel, who's going to be talking about the small-scale indoor and outdoor food waste composting, basically a recap.
Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon. I'm Rakesh Patel, engineer in the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, extending you a warm welcome into my part of the presentation. So far, we covered the new exempt activities that warrant changes to the existing rules. Now, before I go into the additional detail of the two proposed food waste composting exemptions, the outdoor and indoor food waste composting, I would like to refresh your memory with few items that we discussed last year during our stakeholder meeting on November 10th, 2020. For operational requirement, we sought and received your feedback on the yearly throughput capacity, processing time, and pile dimension, etc. Second, we had suggested the suitable buffer distance of the operational area from the property line. Third, we also thought about the storage of the bulking agent. Fourth, we emphasize on the importance of the operator training to run the operation effectively. And finally, we requested how the daily record should be maintained. Next slide, please. So under this exemption, the department proposed these three critical design criteria: gas permeable and water repelling compost cover, leachate collection, and air blower system to operate the outdoor food waste composting. I am stating the obvious, but the rationale behind this requirement is to protect environment and human health, especially to control the odor and stormwater contact, which may create potential environmental harm both on-site and off-site. We want to acknowledge and recognize that this would incur some cost. To ensure that your voices are considered, I would now like to open the floor to you to give your input. The way we plan to gather your valuable input and thought is through answering the question in the next slide. So the question number 15 is, what are some of the preferable solutions or alternatives to gas permeable and water repellent cover for the compost pile? The options are answered. You have to type in, and I'll give you 60 seconds to answer the question. Question number 16. Do you see any challenges in implementing this technology, which includes the cover, leachate collection system, and air blower? The answer options are A, cost, B, maintenance, C, both A and B, D, other typing feature. So 60 seconds starts now. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Now we are going to briefly talk about the indoor food waste composting. So during the last stakeholder meeting, we also talked about indoor food waste composting. And under this, most of the criteria is same as the outdoor food waste composting. So I'm not going to repeat here, but let's focus on the building design aspect, which obviously is a much different setup. Next slide, please. So the idea behind consideration of this exemption is to allow food waste composting within underutilized building space owned or leased by large corporate campuses, college and universities, nonprofits, and other entities. Another benefit behind proposing indoor food waste composting is that it eliminates the possibility of water contact and also help minimizing the odor due to due to activities occurring in a building or shared with roof and wall. Next slide, please. Just so that we are clear, the existing building may or may not require modifications that are necessary to protect the environment. Appropriate slopes are necessary to avoid leachate ponding and leachate to flow towards the drainage. The air ventilation needs to be in place to control the odor from spreading outside the facility. So although you may have a vacant or underutilized space, it may require building modification to meet this criteria, which will result in additional cost. So we'll again gather your thoughts and input in the next slide on this topic. Next slide. So question number 17. What are the other alternatives to ensure appropriate leachate collection? For example, manual floor washing, floor cleaning using industrial vacuum or machine, etc. Please provide your answer using the type-in feature. Question number 18. Do you see any challenges in implementing air management system? Answer A is cost, B is space, C maintenance, D all of the above, E other type-in feature using type-in feature. Thank you for your engagement and for providing your valuable input. I will now pass on the ball to our moderator, Judy.
Thanks, Rakesh. Our first person to raise a hand is Nick Smith-Sebasto. Please give us your comments.
Yes, hello again. Well, so this, thank you, Rakesh, for your presentation. But this whole section again, the challenge I have with it is it presumes, based on the pictures and the questions, basically only one type of technology to be used in composting indoors. There are a variety of ways of composting indoors, some of which would negate these questions because there is no leachate to be managed. There are no odors to be managed. So I guess I'm kind of connected to the same challenge that I'm having is the restrictive nature of the questions. And I'm really curious about whether or not all types of technologies have been considered or not. And if the objective here is simply to figure out how to regulate basically windrows that are put inside of buildings, okay, great, then that's fine. But I just need that to be clarified, because if the mission is to understand how to regulate indoor composting, then I believe all available technologies simply must be considered. Thanks.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. Next up is Jay.
So I would like an answer to the question Nick just had. Is this particular exemption for Windrow technology?
DEP staff, Rakesh, Karen?
Yes, these two are specifically designed to regulate the Windrow technology. We have already proposed the in-vessel composting in a previous stakeholder meeting. So what the focus of today's discussion was to make sure that we hear your voice on this, to make sure that what the additional costs that are going to be incurred, whether any regulated communities has any concern or things of that nature.
Okay, and do you have a number in mind as far as cubic yardage, tonnage, or is that still up for debate yet?
Yeah, it is still up for debate.
And so that's going to make a huge difference. As most of you know, I started composting in a windrow on a farm in 2005 and continue to compost to this day. My first RD&D I did in conjunction with Rutgers University. The study is out there, and it was utilizing the geotextile mesh covers. The covers do a great job. They work. They completely eliminate leachate. So we need to change the mindset a little bit, because if you're going to utilize these covers, then leachate is not a factor. A properly built windrow with the proper moisture content to start with does not generate leachate. So if we're going to use the covers, then that changes that.
Jay, would you be willing to send us an email or to send us more information about what you're discussing right now? Because I think we might find that beneficial, and I know that we would take that under advisement.
The
At the end,
RD&D is actually in the public domain. It was done by Steve Komar at Rutgers University, but I'm sure I can pull it up as well and forward it to you.
that
We
would be
did
great.
pretty extensive research on utilizing the covers. Some of the challenge with the covers is moisture management. So when you get into windrows and composting, recipe is the key to everything. And the biggest part of that is moisture management. So when you start utilizing covers, you have to have a way to add moisture when it's needed. The other thing with the covers is I found out the hard way. In the wintertime, they freeze. They freeze to the ground. They freeze to the point where you can't move them on the rows. So now you start looking at a mechanical way to install them on and off the rows. So this is where knowing what that number is, what the allowable volume is going to be. So somebody that's only composting 10,000 cubic yards a year, it's going to be challenging to offset the costs of the covers and the equipment to make that work. As a business, we need to be viable. So we need to really take into consideration how much you're going to allow, say, an operator like me to process on a site. Because if I can't process enough material to offset the costs of the equipment and daily management costs, then this whole process stops. The other thing is I see a lot of emphasis, on reliance on buildings for odor management, building for water control. And I can tell you after composting for 15 minutes, you're missing the mark, or 15 years, you're missing the mark here. Proper windrow construction, proper recipe is the key to controlling odors. You can take a cover-it building like you had in the slide and have a windrow that's way too high in nitrogen, way too high in moisture content. And just because it's in a building does not mean that you're going to contain those odor issues or those odor problems. The building will help with moisture management, but it's not the answer to it. This is some of the things that I've been working on the last 15 years and really trying to demonstrate. And there's a woman from Cornell University that I refer to often as Jean Bontal as the composting goddess. She's extremely intelligent. She's very, very hands-on. And she has proven time and time again that you can compost just like I'm doing on a compacted soil pad without a building and not have leachate problems, not have odor problems. Many of you have been to my site and you've seen it. It's not perfect, but I'm concerned that we start leaning on buildings as the answer and we get away from the actual science, which is the answer. So I'm really concerned with some of the questions that were here and the direction that some of this is going. We can't really answer it until somebody gives us a number. I'm currently permitted for 38,000 cubic yards. I can run a green, successful business, pay my staff good salaries. But if you tell me that, we can only be exempt up to 10,000 cubic yards, I can tell you for a fact you can't run a viable business. You can't take in enough materials. So I think that's kind of a big number we need to get a handle on.
And Jay, I think you have a lot of good, interesting points on that. I'd like to toss in what was put in the chat that relates to what we were talking about, that basically performance rather than design dictates are more relevant. This was posed by Wayne Defeo, and that DEP should focus on the performance to control odor, etc., and not state how to control the odor via a dictate on specific covers. Jay, I'd like to ask if you could send us more information about what you've been talking about to the email that's going to be on one of our last slides. That would be very beneficial. We'd like to hear more about that. From the DEP staff side, do we have any specific responses to Jay at this point? We still have 2 more speakers.
Okay, so I just think we need to keep in mind that these exemptions are not intended for commercial operations, right? These are intended for use, as Rakesh suggested, by a university campus that happens to have an extra building on campus that they're not using. These are not to take the place of a RD&D like Jay has, or a Class C like several other facilities have. These are not large-scale money makers. These are designed to allow individuals under certain circumstances who have these resources the ability to compost their own food waste. So we have to keep in mind, and I'm afraid some of these questions might have been misleading. Again, the whole idea is to spur discussion, but these are small scale, and we do wrestle with defining what small scale means, but again, I don't think the whole idea here is to replace an RD&D under the solid waste rules or a Class C permit.
In other words, what's the maximum that's not quite big enough or not quite extensive enough to require a permit?
Right.
We're talking about that with the exemptions, because you're going to need a permit, but if you're in this confined lower, let's call it a lower tier, you wouldn't need a permit. And that's kind of what the focus of the language for the exemptions is meant to be. Okay, we have a input from Wayne Defeo. I agree that these are not for commercial, but design standards should all be performance-based, whether commercial or exempt. Wayne, that's duly noted. We'll take it under advisement. Jay, do you have anything further for your comment right now?
No, I agree with that. I think, you know, even if it is, say, like a campus that's going to do less than 10,000 cubic yards a year, you know, the fact is that the covers work. They work really well. But then we shouldn't be concerned about leachate, because that's what the covers are eliminating. Same thing if it's in a building. You know, in a building on a pad, you still shouldn't be generating, you know, any leachate of any kind to be concerned of. So just another, you know, with what Wayne said, a design standard that kind of, regardless of the size, all kind of needs to be implemented.
All right, thank you, Jay. I'd like to move on to Jennifer Mclean.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think the presenters did a great job of bringing this up repetitively, but I just wanted to point out, and I'm with Air Enforcement, I'm filling in for Larry C. today. There currently is no exemption in the air regulations for composting. As far as applicability, composting needs an air permit. And kind of going back to the micro scale composting, I think that may be an internal discussion the DEP is going to have as far as a blanket exemption. Because as of right now, if you are a college campus and you're doing composting, you require an air permit.
Okay. Jennifer, thank you so much for your input from the air program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's see, we don't have any more hands raised, and in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to press forward. May I see the next slide, please? I'd like to go over the suggested changes and proposed changes that we'd like to make to 1.4b. 1.4b is the section that applies to all of the exemptions in the rule, everything that's in 1.4a. We're considering focusing on claim prevention for multiple exemptions of certain types for contiguous sites that are controlled by the same person. Basically, we want to make sure that if you're having an exemption for A and an exemption for B, if you're having it on the same property, the real intent is to circumvent the need for a permit So we're looking to basically limit the use of the exemptions so that the intention of the exemption is what's going to be a result of taking the exemption. We are also talking about DEP discretion to limit a person's claim of a combination of multiple exemptions, whether it's contiguous sites, whether it's the same owner, for the same reasons. Also, we would like to make sure that DEP's acknowledgement is received before your exemption operations take place, because the big thing is the whole notification issue. We want to make sure that the department is aware that you've taken an exemption, that your local municipal and county officials know that an exemption has been taken. It's more of a making sure that we know that you exist out there type thing. There's also, we're focusing on proposing a 1-year cycle for exemptions. Basically, again, it goes back to the whole notification thing. We want to make sure that if you take an exemption, you're still using it in year 2, or you're still using it in year 3. But if you only need it for the 1 year, you won't have to submit paperwork to renew that. So basically, filling into this process would be an annual fee for your initial application and for your renewal of your application to hold an exemption. We want to make sure that all parties are knowledgeable of the existence of the exemption, because we found in the past that sometimes someone might have taken out an exemption, sent a letter to the department saying, I'd like to have an exemption for A. Then 5 years down the road, they're not having the exemption anymore, but it's still on our records that it still exists. It's one of those things where we're looking for more transparent record keeping and more transparent use of the exemption possibilities. For holders of exemptions that already exist prior to the adoption of any of our amendments, there will be a phase-in period for applying for them, maintaining them. That's something that will be worked out on the back end once we reach the point of proposal. And I think that was the point on 1.4b. Next slide, please. I'd like to toss back to Karen Clue for one more extra point that we've been thinking about just recently, which has come up in our deep dive into going over the exemptions and the purpose, the intent, and how we'd like to see the exemption part of the program move forward.
Thanks, Judy. I want to bring up one more possible addition to 1.4b that Judy did not cover. When we were thinking about the big picture, an idea just came to us, and I would like to introduce it as a concept and get your feedback. I would not want to go through 7 stakeholder meetings and include a provision in the proposal that was not introduced during the stakeholder process. So the idea behind exemptions is that they set forth criteria which determine if an approval or a permit is required, right? It's like a Happy Meal. If you go to McDonald's and you're 6 years old, you get the Happy Meal for free. But if you're 7, you don't. So in my mind, this is analogous to the exemptions. If you fall below the criteria set forth in 1.4a, you can operate without a permit. But if you exceed or can't operate within the exempt limitations or criteria, you must get a permit, and the exempt activities must cease until a permit is issued. Therefore, the department is considering an explicit addition to 1.4b to allow the department to terminate the activity being conducted if the operator exceeds or disregards the bar set in the rules, or in the case of my analogy, you turn 7. This is a novel concept because we all know that baked into the permit termination process is the right to a hearing. But given that there is a significant delay in going before an administrative law judge, we felt that the delay could be particularly problematic for food waste exemptions that are being introduced if they are not managed within the limits or properly. Food waste composting can have a huge impact on neighboring properties very quickly due to odors and pests. So this is a concept that we are floating. We are talking to our attorneys about it, but because it's not the typical process associated with a permit termination, we wanted to hear from you. So with that, I'd like to open the floor.
Okay, first up we have Jay Fisher.
Now, of course, you know you're going to have to hear from me, Karen. Again, so it's funny when I hear you talk about this, I see you coming at it from a facility that's problematic.
Right.
And me as a business owner, I look at it as the other way, as a individual got involved in the business and they're growing their business and they want to take it to the next level. So from my perspective, I actually like this because I think there's a lot of, I've spoken to several young people throughout the tri-state area that are interested in getting involved in recycling, composting, all these different kind of things, but they don't have the resources to do it on a bigger scale. So they get into it on a small scale and they start to grow their business very similar to the way I did. The problem is right now, and I've been saying this since 2005, you're either an exempt or you're a Class C. So from your perspective, I see where you guys are coming from. You know, you don't want this to get out of control and become a nightmare, which it can very quickly, specifically with food waste. From a small business perspective like myself, I see this as another opportunity and another highlight of we need a tiered system of permitting and regulation, right? So from your side of it, I get it 100%. From my side of it, I agree with this, but I would want to see that tier permitted structure, a way for people like myself that don't have money, we don't have financial backers, that we want to grow our business and be successful, but we can't do it under the current permit structure.
So, so we have one gentleman on DEP guy staff on the call that did the one of the presentations, and he's also on the Dirty Dirt rule team. And so this may be something, Dan, you want to make note of, because as part of the Dirty Dirt rulemaking, we're going to have to open the recycling rules. And I'm wondering if we want to try during that rulemaking to tackle the tiered permit.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Jay, for that explanation. Yeah, I fully agree with that. It has been something that has come up a couple times internally in the past. And yeah, I will make a note for that. Thank you.
Thanks,
Well,
Dan.
thank you for saying that. If I wanted to put my camera on right now, you'd all see me doing a happy dance, because this is what I've been pushing for the last 15 years, a way for small businesses to grow in New Jersey in a way that we can do it. Because right now, even still at the level that I'm at now, I would struggle, really struggle to pay the DEP Class C fees and still be sustainable. So thank you all. And you know, I know I'm a giant pain in the ass, but I really appreciate what the solid waste group, what you guys are doing. You're making an effort, and it's noticeable and appreciated. I'm going to try to refrain from bashing stormwater and air, but I find it really disappointing that they're not on board with this and they're not participating, because that's my next struggle, is dealing with them. I've sent them multiple emails over the last 6 months and have gotten no response, whereas all of you usually very quickly take the time to respond. Even if you don't have the answer, at least give me some kind of response. And you know, the air group, same thing. You know, to go after these community gardens, and you know, like some of the things I'm dealing with them now is with the stormwater. You know, if I take flowers from ShopRite, I have to get a different permit than if you put your flowers in a lawn and leaf bag. either way, they're both tulips. What's the difference where I collect it from? So these are some of the things that we're really, from the business side, struggling with. So I really appreciate what all of you are doing. Thank you.
Jay, thank you for your input, and thank you for the good conversation that we've had today. Next up is Gary Vondermeyer.
Thank you. Karen, I think the department needs this type of criteria to be able to terminate and pull the plug, to bring integrity to the whole process. If someone is out of compliance with it, I think you need that ability, and I think it's good that you're thinking ahead to insert it. The only comment I would make is that the devil is in the details, and that there be some type of a process associated with it. So it's not just a disgruntled neighbor that hates the place, or like a single occurrence that's relatively minor, that there be some verification or perhaps some kind of process of, something progressive like warning, some kind of a notice, and then termination. But I think you really need this authority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. Next up is Matt Carmel.
Thanks, Judy. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So, I agree with Gary. We're talking about stripping protections for exemption holders that permit holders otherwise have. And I understand that we're trying to, streamline, maintain integrity, but, to take an example, let's say that we're dealing with a community garden under the micro exclusion, or maybe we're not dealing with the exclusion at all. We're just dealing with the exemptions. So maybe that's a bad example, but I'll still use it just for purposes of the discussion. So if community is defined loosely, and we have a disagreement over what the definition of community is, where feedstocks can come from, and the department could pull the exemption based on that not meeting the criteria, and that the community garden would have limited appeal rights. Now they still would have, appeal rights, just not through the, administrative law process. They'd have it through the general court process. But we're basically, without instituting some kind of more informal, limited process, we're pushing these non-commercial activities, if they want to appeal, into litigation, which is, not really going to happen in my view. So I'm a little bit opposed to this, but I haven't thought that much about it at this point, but it is, I'm more worried about, marginal disagreements about the scope of different projects, the definitions of the projects, than a project being complained about. And so that's where I sort of get into, I certainly favor an informal process outside of the administrative law, maybe, but I'm concerned about taking away protections.
So, Ray, I hear you, and I guess we would reserve this step for very serious abuses. And the problem that I guess I see is that I'm saying that, right? And I'm really well intentioned, but I don't know that you guys believe me, right? So without defining what a serious infraction is, you could be concerned that we may act in this termination on something less concerning. But from my point of view, we don't want to put people out of business, and we want to encourage recycling. So I think Gary's idea of having some kind of progressive process that people have an opportunity to kind of clean up their act before we terminate them is a really good idea. My big concern is that we're going to have somebody who is perpetually out of compliance and really impacting their neighbor. Again, food waste really raises a lot of people's concerns in the department without having the ability to swiftly act. And the administrative hearing process is just so overwhelmed that you request a hearing and you sit. And that is not acceptable. So obviously we don't want to inspire litigation, and we want to give people a chance, but they're not all food waste composters are good guys, right? And they're not all going to be successful. And I think we need a way of swiftly dealing with those individuals. And we would exercise that termination I would see very sparingly.
All right, do we have any more input?
I was going to offer just another comment, if that's all right, Judy.
Sure.
So what I was going to say is it sort of sounds like the issue isn't specific to exemptions. The issue is more general to, a problem, a limitation of the administrative law process. But as we open the exemptions, we want to open them carefully. And I guess I understand that and appreciate that, but don't want to sort of overcompensate for the issues with the administrative law process without some kind of replacement.
Right, and I hear you, and I think that's a really valid point. So, I keep saying that because these are not approvals, these are not permits, that these are simply, the department simply acknowledges receiving a notification that the same due process is not afforded to a permit holder. But you're right, we have the same problems in permit world as we do in exempt world. But like I said, it's well baked in. Well, the process for terminating a permit is very well established. So I would not at all suggest that. And the stakes are much higher, right? It's much more investment. So I think maybe that's appropriate. But again, we have these exempt operators, and again, not all of them are good guys that just take in material. They create a landfill on their property, and the department impacting their neighbors and the environment, and the department's hands are tied. So we're looking for a way, and being very upfront about it, perhaps putting on the notification form that you acknowledge that if the department unilaterally terminates you, you will not request a hearing. And going in, you make that business decision that you're comfortable with that or not. And then you have to get a permit. So this is kind of our rationale. And again, it's really in the idea phase, but like you said, while we have the rules open, if we could do something that is thoughtful, and now's the time to do it.
Matt, do you have anything further?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your questions and for your input. Do we have any more discussion on this particular topic? Okay, if not, we're going to move on to our next slide. I'd like to talk about 1.4C. Actually, the existing 1.4C, we intend to move that to be a 1.4D because we're putting in language at 1.4C regarding certifications. This language requires individuals to sign detailed certification language, and it's consistent with our other rules of the site remediation and waste management program. For example, in the underground storage tank rules, the administrative requirements for the remediation of contaminated sites, and the heating oil tank rules. Getting into the specifics, in terms of a certification statement, there's additional permit and approval attesting that must be done, indicated by the below statement, basically saying including obtaining applicable municipal, county, state, and federal permits and approvals. That's basically the applicant telling us that yes, we did get the approvals that we needed from state, local, and county to be able to use this particular exemption. Sorry. There's also clarification in terms of the individuals that would be signing the certification on behalf of the entity that wants to take out the exemption. For a corporation, it would be a responsible corporate official. And the responsible corporate official would include your president, your secretary, your treasurer, the manager of manufacturing, production, and operating facilities, as long as the manager is authorized to make management decisions governing those facility operations and is permitted to sign the corresponding document. For limited liability companies, it would include the responsible company official, which is an example, which is the individual with binding authority between the company and the exemption itself. For partnerships, it would be a partner. For sole proprietorship, it would have to be the proprietor. So that's basically the same person that would sign with the existing exemptions and any certifications related to them. For a municipal, county, state, federal, or other public agency, it would require a principal executive officer or a ranking elected official. Basically, a principal executive officer would be the chief executive officer or senior executive officer, and the latter would be defined as having responsibility over the entire operation. Lastly, it could be a duly authorized representative that signs the certification, where the authorization is made in writing, which is the same as before. The authorization would specify the individual or occupant with responsibility over the operation, which is a slight wording adjustment from the existing rule. And the responsible person conducting the operation would submit the authorization to the department. Next slide. Sorry, I flew through that really quickly. It's more of a pro forma type thing that's similar to our other rules, just to make sure that we have the right person for the entity signing on behalf of the entity, so we know that you're going to be taking an exemption. I'd like to thank you for your time, your attention, and your input today. I think we had a really, really great stakeholder session. I love the go-between and the talking and the dialogue and the questions and the fact that all of you were so open to discussing these issues with us today. Summaries of the topics covered at today's meeting and relevant information will be made available following the meeting at the site that you see listed, the https at www.nj.gov/dep/workgroups/index.html. Following the New Jersey Register publication of the rule proposal, formal comments on the rules may be made by anyone during the announced comment period that will follow. We would like to have you direct your main questions via email to the Exempt Recycling general email box, which is listed here at exemptrecycling@dep.nj.gov. Jay, we're talking to you. Please send us your information that you would like us to consider, as well as all of the rest of you who are attending today. If you would like to provide us with any additional information to take under advisement for this rule effort, we would ask that you send it to that email address. On behalf of the DEP staff, the Solid Waste Management Division, and the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program, I thank you for attending today's stakeholder session. It was really invaluable discourse, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon. We intend to have the proposal out hopefully early next year. And if you have any questions, please email us at the site below. Thank you again so much for coming.